let's begin with the following introduction. Here in this part of the world, it's Erev Tisha B'Av, after Chatzos, and some poskim, there are more amongst them, are not excited at all about learning Torah at this time. However, there are kulas, there are those who are mekil, and even amongst the machmirim, if we're learning about Tisha B'Av itself, then everybody seems to agree that that's mutter. For those who are on a different clock and it's the morning of Erev Tisha B'Av, then no doubt that this is perfectly okay. What we have for the laws of Tisha B'Av is the following introductory question, which hopefully will move us throughout the shir, and that is Manishtana. How is this Tisha B'Av different than any other Tisha B'Av? And one of the focal points of our discussion will be someone who tested positive for corona and yet is not suffering any symptoms. We're going to have two polar extremes which are simple. We're going to have a case of someone who is in quarantine, but he feels absolutely no symptoms. He's feeling great, or as Simon and Garfunkel would say, feeling groovy. And for such a person, he will fast on Tisha B'Av. On the other extreme, we'll have people who haven't been tested, but have symptoms. And it seems that the scientists have determined that in more cases than none, there will be symptoms that clearly indicate the virus even without a test. And in case such a person does not have Tisha B'Av, forget about Tisha B'Av as far as eating and drinking is concerned. But in between the two polar extremes, we have to really analyze Tisha B'Av for cases of either A, someone who tested positive, he's not just in quarantine because he had some connection with someone who tested positive, he himself did not test positive. That's a whole different story. But somebody who tested positive and has symptoms, someone who did not test at all and has symptoms, what are those symptoms? And will such a person fast on Tisha B'Av? Now, by way of introduction, we have to assume a tripod. There are three levels of fast days. On top of the pole is Yom Kippur. Yom Kippur is a doraisa, it's a biblical requirement of fasting. And the Torah goes as far as to say that if someone doesn't fast on Yom Kippur, he incurs a chiyuv kares. For Yom Kippur, the only leniency that we'll have for eating and drinking is going to be what we call a chole sheyesh bo sakana. Someone who has been determined after asking a baki, again, some posts can require asking 3 bakim, but la halacha, let's get it from 1 baki. One expert physician tells him if he fasts, then he might endanger his life. In such a case, even on the great fast of Yom Kippur, he will not fast. And just to tell you a little story, you know, I like to tell stories. My wife was pregnant, and I was a Talmud in Rav Soloveitchik's class, and I asked him if she would fast on Yom Kippur. Immediately, he tells me, yes, she will fast on Yom Kippur. But, he adds, if she sees the following symptoms, and he starts describing them, then no Yom Kippur. So I was a smart aleck, and maybe to this day I regret it, but I said to him, Rebbe, you mean we should feed her pachos mikashir? You know, every 9 minutes, give her half a koseves. So he starts raising his voice. He says, I told you there's no Yom Kippur for her. She should eat kisudas Shlomo HaMelech b'shaito. Now, we don't know exactly what the Suda of Shlomo HaMelech was like, but it was a very lavish banquet, and it probably exceeded even that of Henry VIII. Anyway, Baruch Hashem, my wife did not have symptoms and she was able to fast on Yom Kippur. So that's Yom Kippur. Yom Kippur requires, for any leniency, a chole sheyesh bo sakana. How do we determine a chole sheyesh bo sakana? Is it on the basis of the physicians? How many physicians? Could it be on the basis of a person's own assumption that I need to eat or I'll die? Would it be a case, for example, of a woman who's just given birth? And for those who are learning Daf Yomi, you remember that a woman after birth is called a chaya or yoledes, and there are very, very great leniencies as far as eating and drinking on Yom Kippur for a chaya, for a yoledes, whether it's the first 3 days, even if she doesn't ask to eat, whether it's the next 4 days up to day 7 where she asks to eat. There are even cases of a pregnant woman where they allow her to eat on Yom Kippur because of the pikuach nefesh to the fetus. That's called in the language of the Gemara Yuma achazaso bolmus. That means she smelled something, and there's a fear because she was overwhelmed by that wonderful smell, she might abort the baby, and in such case, that becomes a chol sheyesh bo sakana. Now let's drop 2 levels down to the bottom level, and then we'll get back to Tisha B'Av. And this is called Shar Tzomos, other fast days. Included in that is Shavasa B'Tammuz, Tzom Gedalia, Tainus Esther. These are the fast days which are most lenient. And in regard to these fast days, we don't need a chole sheyesh bo sakana. All we need is a chole she'ein bo sakana. Anyone who's categorized as a chole she'ein bo sakana, which may mean that fasting for them is difficult, is challenging, very uncomfortable, but there's no chashash, there's no medical basis for assuming that by fasting, they will endanger their lives. So just X out the whole issue and possibility of sakon. However, because these are the lenient fasts, even though we're talking about a chole she'ein bo sakona, there's no life-threatening situation, and it won't lead to any life-threatening situation. Nevertheless, there's no obligation to fast. Would there be a possibility of fasting? Well, we're going to see soon the Chayei Adam that if the person is suffering a very great weakness, then we're not even going to allow you to fast. We're going to force you to eat. And here we have another kula. In addition to the fact that a chole she'ein bo sakana, if that person is suffering as a result of the fast, either from hunger or from dehydration, the desire for drinking, such a person will eat. That's kula number 1. Kula number 2 is that with regard to these other fast days, an uberes umenika does not fast. A woman after childbirth, or a woman who is pregnant. So we have pregnant women, we have women after childbirth, especially in case of a nursing woman, they do not fast on those fast days. But now we get to the middle category, which is the category that we're about to enter. And if Phil joins us, he's already in that situation. He's already in Tisha B'Av. In such a case, ubros, meinikos, misanos, pregnant women and women after birth will fast, in contrast to the other tzomos like Shavasa B'Tammuz, etc. And that places Tisha B'Av on a status that's very similar to Yom HaKippurim. Just like in Yom HaKippurim, barring exceptional cases, a pregnant woman will fast. Even a woman after birth, in certain cases, will fast. And that chumrah, that stringency, was superimposed on Tisha B'Av as well. So that Tisha B'Av has striking similarities to Yom HaKippurim. For example, The Laila of Tisha B'Av is included in the fast. No conditions will help you to alleviate the commencement of the fast with nighttime. In that sense, it's like a full Yom Tainus, similar to the paradigm of Yom Tainus, which is Yom Kippurim. However, we must keep in mind that Yom Kippurim is D'Rabbanan. And with all due respect to upgrading Tisha B'Av, I meant to say Tisha B'Av, I'm sorry if I said Yom Kippurim, that Tisha B'Av is only D'Rabbanan, and with all due respect to our upgrading Tisha B'Av, as we saw in the case of Ubros Umenikos, that they will fast like Yom Kippurim, it still remains a fast day that is D'Rabbanan. And although we mentioned the two kulos of Shivasa B'Tammuz, one is Ubros Umenikos Eino Misanos, and the second was Cholachi She'emo Sakona. The Chumrah of Tisha B'Av is explicit with regard to an Uberes and a Menika. We don't find, although that's going to be our research project for today, what about a Chola She'emo Sakona? A Chola She'emo Sakona, whose life is in no way threatened by fasting, but is suffering a Tsar Gadol, is suffering what we call Halishas Haguf. The body itself is weak. The person should get into bed. In such a case, we have a machlokes, two traditions, two minhagim, codified by the Machaber on the one side and the Ramah on the other side. Should such a person be fasting? Is he required to fast on Tisha B'Av? And I will quote to you the language of the Machaber. In Hilchas Tisha B'Av, Siman Tuf Kuf Nun Dalit. And if it helps anybody who might have a Mishnah Berurah in front of them, this you'll see on pages 61 going on to 62. Chole Shu Tzarech Lecho. And the Mishnah Berurah qualifies this by saying, Hu Chalush V'chash Begufo. He is ill and he feels it through his body. There's an overall weakness in his body. Afal Pisha Ein Bo Sakana, Machilin Oso. The language of the Mishnah Berurah, Machilin Oso, in my humble opinion, is indicative of a few words in the Machaber. Maybe the Mishnah Berurah derived his conclusion from the Machaber, because the Machaber writes, quote, Machilin Oso miyad, the person who's a Chol Hashem Bo Sakana, but he feels Chalishas Kol Gufo, and he is in this state of weakness, says the Machaber, listen carefully to the Machaber's Lashon. He says, the b'makom choli lo gazru b'rabbanan. Bosai, I'm not sure if you're on the same page as me. The Machaber is telling me a gavaldige chiddush here. When he says b'makom choli lo gazru b'rabbanan, he is telling me that for such a person whose life is not endangered by fasting, but he will suffer weakness throughout his body, his status is that lo gazru be'rabbanan. And you don't have to be a Briscoe Lamdin to understand what the Machaber is trying to convey to us. This individual, and the Machaber is codifying this in Hilchas Tisha B'Av. Had he said this in Hilchas Shar Tainios, I would have nothing to add. But on Tisha B'Av, he's telling me that b'makom choli lo gazru be'rabbanan. The Rabbanan never enacted the mitzvah of Tainus, of Tisha B'Av, in a makom choli. And what kind of chol are we talking about? A chola she'ein bo sakana. So on the one hand, we've upgraded the status of Tisha B'Av vis-a-vis the other Tainiyos to the status equal to that of Yom Kippurim vis-a-vis the halacha of Ubros and Menikos. But on the other hand, the kula that we found in all Tainiyos, other than Tisha B'Av, other than Yom Kippur, namely that b'makom choli, if he's a chole she'ein bo sakana, and there's no chashash whatsoever of sakana, he's not going to fast. The machaber is applying that same yardstick to Tisha B'Av. Tisha B'Av, my friends, is caught in what I call a tug of war. And I use that term just for pedagogic purposes. One part of Tisha B'Av, one dimension, is pulled towards Yom Kippur, and that's the Ubros Umanikos. There's another part of Tisha B'Av that is pulled towards Shar Tainios, and that's a Chole Shenechlash Gufo. He's in a state of tsar. His body is weak as a result of the fact that he hasn't eaten, he hasn't drunk. And such a person, the Machaber says, is lo gazru be'rabbanan. That's a very heavy statement. And here, I want to quote to the Brisker Rav, my Rebbe's uncle, Rav Belvel. And the story goes that somebody was not feeling well. He was a chola, very, very weak. It was Yom Kippur. It was Tisha B'Av. And it was going into Tisha B'Av. The man came to the Brisker Rav and said, I'd like to fast. So the Brisker Rav said to him, and I have a feeling he meant it cynically, that if you want to fast on Tisha B'Av, then you better accept upon yourself a tainis yachid. And what the Brisker Rav was trying to convey was that he's not included in the mitzvah of fasting on Tisha B'Av. B'makom choli lo gazru be'rabbanan. He wants to accept upon himself a fast as a tainis yachid. That's called Kabbalah's tainis, mincha time before the day you're makabel on yourself a tainis. That's a fine mitzvah. I don't know if it should apply in the case of somebody who's so weak, but don't confuse it with Tisha B'Av. It is not Tisha B'Av. Tisha B'Av is a tainis tzibur par excellence, similar and molded after the prime example of Yom Kippurim. And the Gemara says at the end of tainis, ein bein Tisha B'Av Yom Kippurim. There have been very few differences between the two. You want to accept upon yourself a tainis yachid? Okay, a tainis yachid, but that's not Tisha B'Av. And I believe that the Brisker Rav took the Mechaber literally, that b'makom choli lo gazru be'rabbanan. In fact, we have a precedent for such a halacha in Hilchos Shabbos. Amiro l'nachri shvus. We don't tell a nachri to do a malacha on our behalf on Shabbos, but b'makom choli, we can instruct a guy to do a malacha on our behalf, even though it's a chol she'ein bo sakana. And the Gaon, the Vilna Gaon, proves from this halacha that there is a precedent for being lenient with regard to a chola, not only with regard to the Isur Gzeira of Amir Liakum Shvus on Shabbos, but also, says the Gaon, with regard to fasting on Tisha B'Av. And now we apply the principle of b'makom choli lo gazru be'rabbanan. You want to fast, then you have to go through the rules and regulations that govern a tainis yachid, accept upon yourself a tainis yachid. But that's not what it's all about. That's not Tisha. Call it another entity, a tainis yachid, but it's not a tainis tzibur. The problem that we have here is, before we get to Corona, is the Chassam Sofer. The Chassam Sofer, in the case of the Mechaber, right here in Siman Tov Nun, Tov Kuf Nun Dalet, The Chassam Sofer claims in its Shuva and Arachaim Siman Kufnun Zion, and you have this all on the pages of the Omek Pshat, that the Geder of a Chol She'ein Bo Sakana in Tisha B'Av is what's called Dechuya. It's not Hutra. And therefore, he says, based on this concept called Dechuya, that he should be very careful about how much he eats, and he shouldn't be eating too much. Perhaps he should be eating on a slower basis and wait intervals between one achila and the other. The Brisker Rav, on the other hand, understood that a Chol She'ein Bo Sakana with regard to Tisha B'Av doesn't have Tisha B'Av. That's called the Hutra. It's completely Hutra. It's mutter for him. And what I'd like to study with you is the Ramah, because we began with the Mechaber. Let me read the Mechaber once more. Tov Kuf Nun Dalet Sif Vav. The Mechaber writes, Chol Shehu Sarech Lechol Ein Tzrichen Omeid, which means we don't have to rush him to a physician and determine whether he must eat. The man is a chole. He's very weak. He's bitzar. He's claiming he has to eat. We don't have to worry about Ovid. And then the Mechaber says, "B'mokum choli lo gozru abada." Comes along the Ramah and codifies a minhag. Umiu noagim lisanos kol zman she'en lem tsar gadol sheyesh lachush lisakon. The Ramah writes that we're on the borderline here, in this case of Tsar Gadol, with a Chol sheyesh bo sakon, and he's outspoken about it. He says we'll let him eat on Tisha B'Av. Why? Because yesh lachush l'sakana. If he gets weaker and weaker, it might be a life-endangering situation. This, for sure, in my humble opinion, would reflect the approach of the Chassam Sofer. We're talking about Hutra. We're talking about Dechuya. This is not Hutra. The Ramah, by codifying this minhag, is indicating that not everybody agrees to the formulation of the Mechaber that b'makom choli lo gozu be'rabana. In this case, he's not yet a chol sheyesh bo sakana. Right now, he's a chol she'ein bo sakana. He's very weak. He's suffering, but there's no sakana, and therefore, b'makom choli gozru be'rabanan. Despite the fact that he's ill, he's weak, he's suffering from the tinnitus, says the Ramah, the minhag is he should still be fasting on Tisha B'Av, only on Tisha B'Av. And obviously, the Chassam Sofer has shoulders upon whom he can stand upon. This is all before we get to Corona, because we have to know the basic laws of Tisha B'Av. And according to the Ramah, a person who's not bisakana, he's suffering tremendously from the fast, he is required to fast. However, the Ramah does give us one little admission, and that is that it's a minhag. Nagim lisanos. This is not something that is ikar adin. And therefore, says the Ramah, ha-mekil lo hifsid. If he doesn't want to take advantage of this minhag and say, well, he's got to force himself to fast, then you know what? Lo hifsid. We're not going to hold him in any way responsible if he decides that he's going to rely on the approach of the Mechaber. He's feeling awful, and b'makom choli lo gozru beira banon, and he's allowed to eat. So if you ask the Ramah, what should I do, Rebbe, Rabosh Isserus? Should I fast or should I not fast? I'm suffering tremendously. He says, try to fast as best as you can. There's no life-endangering situation. But if you can't take it, and if it's too much for you, go ahead and eat, and you'll be somech on the mechaber, and that's fine. I just want to make the following point. I don't know if this is relevant to anyone here in the Shia, but if you happen to work in a home or a hospital that has both Jewish and non-Jewish patients, and has both Jewish and non-Jewish physicians, and you will take advice from them, if you're one of the patients, as to whether or not you should fast, then unfortunately, and I say it with a krech in my heart, it's the non-Jewish physicians that will tell you you're okay to fast. And the Jewish physicians, I'm not talking about Orthodox physicians, Yirei Shamayim, they will say, what? Fasting? What do you have to fast for? You're a chol. This is something that my father, Shalom, had to face as the chaplain of the Coney Island Hospital in Brooklyn, New York, for 4 decades. Terrible thing. Okay, Rabbosai. Now we talk about Corona. What is the status of Corona as a chole vis-a-vis the fasting on Yom Kippur? Should he fast? Should he eat? Should he eat a regular meal? Should he eat shiurim, just smaller amounts, spread out over longer time intervals? Or maybe we should tell him that he shouldn't fast at all. And this question is analyzed by the contemporary poskim as we speak, and they divide into different categories. Category number 1, a chole who has tested positive for Corona. Issue number 2, does he have symptoms? And we can talk about some of the symptoms. Issue number 3, what happens if he tested for Corona but he doesn't have any symptoms? Issue number 4, what happens if he came in contact with someone who had the disease and he's required now to be in bidud? And number 4, shall the halacha divide into 2 groups? There's what's called kvutzot sikun, those who have other issues in health and are older people. If you have those 2 factors, number 1, you're suffering from other diseases, blood diseases, pneumonia, or high blood pressure. You're suffering from asthma and other possible pulmonary diseases. And that combination of age and diseases, that could put your situation in great danger. And Rabbosai, again, I don't know what you're watching and what you're seeing. Yesterday, I saw a whole collection, a gathering of physicians. I think it was in the city of Washington. I don't know if you got to see it. If you did, you'll know what I'm talking about when I talk about that Nigerian nurse who has already dealt with 350 COVID patients. And the basic theme and the agenda was that we're going crazy over something that is controllable. And there's a whole discussion about children and so forth and so on. If you get a chance, you'll take a look at it. The only reason I mention it is because some of these physicians have been taking care of Corona patients who have tested positive and they have symptoms. And not only that, they even have other diseases and illnesses that endanger perhaps their immune system. And the physicians are telling them that telling us that we are treating these cases and they are surviving. And maybe our overriding fear is not justifies, it's paralleling the society on levels like education, level like social intercourse, levels like finances, and so forth and so on. Now, since we've established that on Tisha B'Av, there's a chumrah that upgrades the severity of Tisha B'Av way and beyond the bulk of other fasts. And that expresses itself in Me'ubros and Me'nikos, they fast. And the answer is that we're gonna require that they fast because right now they are not considered a chola. And even if I'm going to go like that shita, that a person who cannot come to a chola b'day sakana is nevertheless considered a chola, nevertheless, fasting is not going to in any way endanger the life of a mu'uberes or a menikas, again, unless we have certain symptoms, but as a general rule. And the fact that they are weak, perhaps weaker, they need more energy than everyone else, that's not going to give them a status of a chola sheyesh bo sakana. And a chola she'ein bo sakana fasts on Tisha. Now, the Shulchan Aruch in Siman Tov Kuf Nun Dalid writes that Chaya, which is Yoledes, a woman after birth, for 30 days, she does not fast. Again, we've been talking about pregnant women and about nursing women. Now let's talk about women after birth. And a woman after birth for 30 days does not have to fast. Not only that, a chole shetzarech lechol is he's allowed to eat. And b'makom choli lo gozru be rabbanon, and this is what we saw codified in Shulchan Aruch and in the Ramah. Fine. Now, when the Machaber says that a chole shetzarech lechol is allowed to eat, he adds the phrase that we mentioned before, b'makom choli lo gozru rabbanon. So who is this chole that has to eat? And he's a chole she'ein bo sakana. And again, just by way of introduction, the background is that fasting is not seen as necessarily unhealthy to the body. And the Mishnah Berurah here, Number Yud Aleph says, "Ratzaloma shu cholush v'chash begufo." He's getting very, very weak. He's feeling the weakness. Is therefore afal pisha ein bo sakona machilino. So we have no fear that he'll come to danger, but we will feed him. And this, my friends, is on Tisha B'Av. The Mishnah Berurah is telling us that if he's feeling weak and it's Tisha B'Av, then machilin also. And I think machilin also, as I said before, indicates that it's not even a choice of his decision. He has to. Now, in the Bir Halacha, he begins to open up a little bit of a window for exceptions to these rules. And that is that perhaps a chole she'ein bo sakana should be eating on Tisha B'Av, even if he's not chole and chalash begufo. And this is the case of an epidemic disease. And back in the day of the Mishnah Berurah, this was common when Nebuch there was cholera. Cholera is a very infectious disease. So the Bir Halacha writes, Ein b'sefer Piskei Olam. I'm not familiar with the sefer. The B'makom she'ena machla shel cholera hazaka chas v'sholom. To say that when there's a magefa of cholera, then there is no Tisha B'Av because of the Mechaber's language, B'makom choli lo gazru be'rabbanon. He says, you know what? You're going to close shop on fasting. And that's not something that we want to do. And therefore, says the Mishnah Berurah, chas v'sholom, that we should tell him he's going to eat. And b'shtia, and also drinking. And Misha Rotza Lisanos B'Makom She'ena Machla B'Zam Chas V'Sholom Yesh La'atzro Ulazhiro Shelo Yelech V'Pesach Beiso Kolayim. He should lock himself up in his room. I would like you to join me in this very interesting journey of the Bir Halacha, in which he based himself on the Piskei Olam. He's telling you that if the machla of cholera is chazaka, which means that it's raving and it's going amok, it's infecting the millions out there, then chas v'sholom, to allow such a person to eat. But he says, what if the machla of cholera is eno chazaka? He says in that case, we're not going to have him eat. We'll add a little bit to the staff, the nursing staff, and we're going to make sure and supervise him. How is he doing? And if we find that he's possibly spreading this disease, we have to immediately tell him to stop eating.
Again, I'm sorry.
Bir Halacha to you, because the Bir Halacha seems to indicate that on the one hand, if the machla of cholera is not strong, then we cannot say lo gazru rabbanon tainis. There is a possibility of fasting. And he says the following. If there's a possibility that he's spreading the disease, then chas v'sholom, we cannot perhaps even allow him to fast. And even though we recommend him to be very careful, we're not going to rely on him. So if there's a heter during a machla magefa, then we have to know that that magefa is tested positive for corona. It's in a state of bidud, at the end of which, in Mitzvah Hashem, they'll be able to return to the Jewish community.
Rav, can you clarify? I'm sorry. This person has cholera, or he's in danger.
It's a case of someone who is in an environment and found in a location where there is cholera, but the cholera is not in its pinnacle. It's not chazak. And here he says that since the language is Eina machla shel cholera chazaka, and he writes that he has to fast.
You understand how it's different than our case, or it's right. We're asking, he's already has symptoms with our case, right?
Well, again, as I said at the outset, we're going to deal with many different scenarios, and I see that it's getting late. We better get into the many different scenarios. But I think you should keep in the background that the Mishnah Berurah, based on the Piskei Olam, in a case of machla shel cholera, he differentiates between chazaka and not chazaka. And if it's not chazaka, then he doesn't want a person like that fasting.
So you would compare that to, say, he was in New York at the beginning? Is that what you would say?
Again, I'm going to read it's a very terse language in the Mishnah Berurah. He says, "B'makom she'ena machla shel chaleria chazaka, chas v'shalom yochal pachos mikoseves b'chtei achilas pras v'chein v'shtia." And I think he's saying that mimonashach, if the cholera is chazaka, we will not tolerate fasting. If, on the other hand, the cholera is weak at this point and it's not spreading, then, I'm sorry, I got confused again. If the cholera is not spreading, then we're not going to allow him to eat. If the cholera is spreading, then we will require him to eat. That's what I think the Mishnah Berurah. I don't want to get too bogged down in the Bir Halacha because I want to see if we can get the broader picture. We're limited in time. Okay. So Rabbosai, just to summarize, we have this almost anomaly of Tisha B'Av, which is midway between Yom Kippur and Shar Tainios. It shares some of the chumras of Yom Kippur and other kulas of Shar Tainios. We have a major issue in Makom Tsar or Chalishas Haguf on Tisha B'Av. The Mechaber says, Lo Gozru Be'Rabbanan, and he includes Tisha B'Av in Shar Tainios, and if he's a Chola, then he never got the mitzvah and was never included in the mitzvah of Tainus. On the other hand, the Ramah seems to advocate, based on a minhag, that unless he's Sar Gadol, where he can't tolerate it, then we could be more making. But as a general rule, if he's suffering, the Ramah advocates in favor of his fasting. However, we have to be very careful because the Ramah stipulates that yesh lo tsar gadol v'haya lachush l'sakana. The Ramah will only allow a tsar gadol to eat on Tisha B'Av if it might lead to a sakana. Right now, he doesn't have a sakana. But if the continued fasting could bring him into a state of sakana, then we'll allow it. V'amekilo hifsik. There is the sheet of the Mechaber. Cholesh ein bo sakana doesn't fast on Yom Kippur. This person is suffering. He's considered a cholesh yesh bo sakana, despite the fact that he will not come to a life-endangering situation. Now, what I'd like you to do, again, if you have the Omek Shot, and again, I want to thank David for sending it. On page 2, he gets into the Corona issue. His introduction here, which you'll see at number 1, is that the Mogen Avram advocates in our time, if there's Shas HaDever, there's some sort of plague in the air, then if he's Menusa, She'eno Ochel V'Shoso Kolet Chas V'Sholom Shinui Ha'avir, which sounds like the person has a very positive experience. He, I guess, hangs out, if you could use that phrase, in a place where the avir, the air is pure, and it has not been contaminated by the dever. And even though it's a shas dever, and you don't fast the shas dever, dever is a kind of a pestilence, a kind of a magefa. If he's experienced and he knows that he can eat and drink, then his status is different, and he can fast. Says the Bir Halacha in Taf Kuf Nun Dalet that there's a difference between a place where the Magefa is in its full blast with all its power to a place where the Magefa is not in full bloom. It's kind of laid back. And once again, we've seen that already in the Piskei Olam, where he differentiates between machlas, cholera, which is chazaka, and a period of time in which the machla is not so contagious. It's not so aggressive. And here he quotes a tshuva from Rav Yosef Shalom Eliashav, who writes that the reason why we're going to make these distinctions is because he can fast. And if he can fast, even if we're going to tell him, well, he doesn't have to fast, there should be some amount of fasting that he should implement, if for no other reason, just to link up with the Avelis. So Rav Elyashiv is saying that even in a situation where, because of the machla medabekes, we're not going to fast, but we should still have some minimum amount of fasting that'll give him a kiyum of the tainis tzibur. So that's something important. Okay, I'd like to now dedicate the time that we have to the final psak halacha of the contemporary poskim. We'll start with Rav Moshe Sternbach. And he comes to the conclusion that if he's a cholesh ein bo sakana, we have no reason to suspect that the fasting will bring him into a state of cholesh yesh bo sakana. Nevertheless, if the fasting will be machbid cholia, if it will make it more difficult and straining for him to fast, then even if there's no sakana at all, he's poter milusanos. Now, as far as cholera is concerned, is there an equation between corona and cholera? And the poskim quoting the Divrei Hamagid Avram come to the conclusion that corona, although it's something that could spread throughout an entire community, it's not to be classified as cholera, as a magefa maleches. Magefa maleches means that it just keeps going and going, and anyone who comes in the way, it's like an avalanche, a tornado, he will be infected by this disease. So that, according to the poskim, is a period of time described as a machla misaleches, and there's no fasting. But corona does not fit up to that standard of a magefa maleches. Then he quotes Rav Brandsdorfer, one of the great poskim here in the Beis Horah and Meir Sharim, and he says that we should be choshesh shenidbak hu bichlal makom aleches, that maybe he would come down with corona in a way that it would be a machla hamalechus, that it keeps spreading and spreading and spreading. We cannot control the machla. Again, we can discuss this at great length. It's almost a topic within our topic. To what extent would we classify corona as a machla hamaleches, similar to corona? And now Rav Yitzchak Zilberstein on the top left, second paragraph of page 2, divides up the issue into the following 3 categories. Number 1, if he fasts on Tisha B'Av during corona, then if he tested positive for corona, he does not fast at all, because b'makom choli lo gozru be'rabbanan. So again, Rabbi said, please take note that Rabbi Yitzchak Zilberstein is matir someone who tested positive for corona, even if he has no symptoms. Because if you take a look, he didn't specify and qualify this only if he had symptoms. So that's a case of someone who tested positive, even though he has no symptoms. Now we get to the next case. And he's in quarantine because he had contact with someone who was positive, who tested positive. And you and I would have said, all right, there's an extra chumrah here, we have to put him into bidud, but we have no evidence that he came in such close contact with someone who is a chole with corona. And yet, the psak is that he has to eat pachos mikashir. Okay, now I want to get to the main issue for today. And this is a corona patient who was tested positive and he feels great, no symptoms. So Rav Osher Zelig Weiss concludes that if he feels great, then he has the same status as a healthy person, and he's obligated to fast. And basically, according to Rav Weiss's approach, everything depends upon whether he suffers the tasminim of corona. If he doesn't, then he has the halacha of a bari. He's considered healthy, and he has to fast. However, Rav Moshe Feinstein and Rav Moshe Shol Klein disagree vehemently with this approach of Rav Weiss. And what is their opinion? They say that once he tests positive, even in the absence of tasminim, v'afilu chole me'umas im tasminim. For example, he doesn't have his ability to taste or to smell. Is he fasts? The only one who won't fast is a chole me'umas who has tasminim. So whereas Rav Weiss will allow a person who was a chola and he was misrape, according to the second opinion, if he's a chola me'umas, he's got to fast. Second, I'm sorry. Again, I just want to get the sheet. According to Rav Weiss, what we're saying is that if he's feeling great, then he's chayav in the mitzvahs. He has a din of a bar, and the experts will tell him that fasting from time to time is very healthy for the body. Isn't this amazing? Rav Weiss is saying that the man is infected with corona, but he feels good. And therefore his status is that of a healthy person. Whereas Rav Moshe Shol Klein assumes that once he tests positive for corona, he's automatically a chola, whether he knows about it, whether it manifests on his body or it doesn't, he is a chola. And the next discussion, which will take us one step further, is someone who has the symptoms, but he wasn't tested yet. He says, Gam cholesh adayin lo umas Piskei Corona hasn't been substantiated by a test. If yesh lo tasminim, lo yotzu. So I would suggest that the main machlokus here is between Rav Osher Zelig Weiss on the one hand and Rav Moshe Shol Klein on the other hand. And this, I think, is going to be the major issue in fasting on Tisha B'Av. According to Rav Weiss, it all depends how you're feeling. If you're feeling good, then you should be fasting. You had corona, it's irrelevant. Everything depends upon how you're feeling. Whereas Rav Moshe Shol Klein says that it all depends upon whether you have tasminim. And if you're a chola me'umas and you have tasminim, then you don't fast. Is there anyone who would go a step further and say that if you're a chola me'umas, even without tasminim, you don't fast? Take a look at the bottom left in the name of Rav Sariel Rosenberg. And he says, Chole Corona Shemeumas Eino Tza Afilu Kishe'ein Lo Tasminin. So according to Rav Sariel, it all depends upon you had a positive test. Once you have a positive test, you don't fast. Whereas Rav Osher Zelig Weiss says, what do you mean he had a positive test? He's feeling great. He could fast for the next month. So why are you exempting him from fasting? He has no tasminim. Now, Rav Moshe Shol Klein is in the middle here between, this battlefield between Rav Osher Zelig Weiss and Rav Moshe Shol Klein. And therefore, he will take a middle of the road approach. And he'll say the following, that if he's a chola me'uma, but he has no tasminim, he will fast, just like we saw in Rav Osher Zelig Weiss. And now, what happens if he has tasminim? He tested positive and he has symptoms. Says Rav Moshe Shol Klein, let's put on the table, what are his symptoms? He says, Afilu chola me'umas, im atasminim shel ibud chush reach v'ruach yatsu. If he doesn't smell, and he can't taste his food, that's not called tasminim. And he'll have to fast. If on the other hand, he's a chola me'umas, but he has tasminim, He's got chol, chom. He lost his sense of taste. And those are tasminim. Again, if he loses chush tam v'reach, he doesn't smell and he doesn't taste, then he should fast. But if he's number one, me'umas, and number two, what tasminim does he have? He has chom, he has temperature, or he has weakness. Then he doesn't fast. So you see that Rav Moshe Shol Klein is very hesitant to alleviate a person who was a chole corona and he was tested positive from fasting. Regular tasminim, low profile, that's called ibud chush hatam v'reach, he should fast. If he has more radical expressions of tasminim, he's got fever, he's got weakness, then he doesn't fast. Now we get to the issue of someone who did not test positive, but he has the symptoms. Says Rav Sariel Rosenberg, he does not fast. I think he's saying that there's so much corona in the air, and it's such a common disease that testing our hin and testing our hair is less important to us than tasminim. But my question to you is there anyone who would say that a chole corona, even without tasminim, does not fast? We saw in Rav Weiss that his opinion is if he's feeling good, he doesn't have to worry about fasting. And here we get to Rabbi Sariel Rosenberg. I think he is the most radical shita lakula, if you will. And it's a chumrah in corona, but a kula in fasting. And he says that chole corona ma'umas eino tzam afilu kishe'ein lo tasminin. So we have one shita that goes on board that if he contracts the disease, he will fast. We have Rav Nosson, Rav Asher Zalek Weiss, and he says that it doesn't matter if he tested positive or not. So Zaini tested positive, but he's feeling good. He feels like a healthy person. Why shouldn't he fast? And we'll finish up, I see it's getting a little late, with Rav Tzvi Weber. I don't know if he's related to Rav Yeshua, but he says, Ibeid chush hatam, if he lost the sense of taste, and going on to page 3, af im lo barur shu chole, we don't have any tests, then he is not going to fast. So it's really interesting. We have situations in which he registered according to the test as positive, and yet he still has to fast because he has no tasminim. We'll have cases where, according to some poskim, he has no tasminim, I'm sorry, he has tasminim, he was never tested, and he will fast. So what is the major criterion for setting up a chole sheyesh bo sakana, she'ein bo sakana, as far as fasting on Tisha B'Av? Is it the fact that he tested positive? Or is it the fact that he has tasminim? And we have two nafkaminas. We have a nafkamina of someone who has tasminim but hasn't been tested. We have someone who's been tested and has no tasminim. He feels great. And personally, I think we should keep in mind this opinion of Rabbi Sariel Rosenberg, who's claiming that once he's a chole corona ma'umas, he doesn't fast on Tisha B'Av. Tasmin ahim, tasmin aher, it doesn't make any difference. Now, I want to let you go here on the bottom of 3 just to give you a quick overview of what we covered tonight. First, we had a distinction between Yom Kippur, which is Doraisa, and you can only override Yom Kippur and eat and drink for Pikuach Nefesh to save human life. We had the case of Tainios, where with regard to other Tainios, other than Tisha B'Av, the minhag is to fast unless he has Tsar Gadol. Then we have someone who has contracted the disease. We have positive influence that he is a chole corona. Then Sam Tisha B'Av. Now he says over here, B'tkufas HaKorona. I would say even in Tkufas HaKorona. Now, Onam she tola mi'od, shechola ma'od, v'nafal mishkav l'chol ha'deis oslo lotum, and I'm not sure when he says oslo lotum, I guess he's talking about a chola ma'od. Chola ma'umas, right? He's been taken in by another family. We have one shita that says a chola ma'umas lo yitzave afilu lilotas minim. And these seem to be the conclusions. Now, what's strange is, if you saw the pages from Rav Willig, when they asked him about fasting on Yom Kippur, on Tisha B'Av, he writes in his very short, precise, typical language, same as all years. And I think after the analysis that we did in contemporary poskim, we attempted to think that it's not the same necessarily as all years, because there are poskim who will say that once he tests positive, doesn't matter whether he had simonim or not, tasminim, he should not fast. We also had a shita that even if someone does not test positive, but he has certain of the manifestations of corona, then he should not fast. Okay, so let's take a break now. I think pretty much what we did today was an understanding of corona in terms of fasting on Tisha B'Av, and we've seen that there may be leniencies because of corona that would not apply during a regular season. Is there anybody who wants to make any comments now? Because I'm going to end the shir now. You should know I sent you a page from Rabbi Yitzhak Berkowitz. He's one of the outstanding young poskim, especially for the Haredi English-speaking category, or Avrechim. And he's worried during this corona period about what he calls high-risk pregnancy. And there are women who are in this category of high risk. Now, one thing I didn't understand, if maybe you could help me, in number 9, in Rabbi Yitzhak Berkowitz's presentation, he writes that one has to immediately drink when there are signs of dehydration. And although he doesn't make that as an absolute rule, but he certainly applies it to nursing and pregnant women. And he's talking about dryness of an extreme nature on Yom Kippur. And he's saying that for the sake of Yoledes, we're going to be more maked. And he applies this to a nursing woman and to a pregnant woman. But what it confuses my mind, he says, or extreme dryness of the mouth. Now, Yesh Lachar, what does he mean by extreme dryness of the mouth? I myself suffer on every single fast day, especially the ones that have the late ending of the fast day, and they start the night before, from extreme dryness of the mouth. So we might as well get rid of all fast days. But that's an important point that he mentions. Okay, then. So that's where we're going to start. We're going to stop. And what I would like to do in the next year, possibly, is to address the case of Birkas HaGomer as it applies to a Cholesh Corona Shenisra. Okay, then? I'm going to bid you all a meaningful fast.